Richard Gray stood near Gate 27 at the bustling New York City airport, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The terminal was alive with the sounds of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the occasional crackle of announcements over the intercom. People streamed past him in every direction, business travelers clutching laptops, families juggling strollers and diaper bags, and tourists snapping photos of the departure boards. Richard, however, remained still, his eyes fixed on the clock above the gate. He wasn't particularly fond of flying. In fact, he hated it. The cramped seats, the recycled air, the constant chatter, it all made him uneasy. But this trip to Los Angeles was unavoidable. His company had scheduled an important meeting, and Richard, being one of their top sales managers, couldn't afford to miss it. He sighed heavily, adjusting the strap of his carry-on bag as he glanced at the line forming for boarding. That's when he noticed him. A man sat a few rows away, leaning back in his chair with a thick book resting on his lap. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white pages of the manual he was reading. The title, Advanced Aircraft Systems, was printed boldly across the cover. Richard squinted slightly, trying to get a better look. There was something about the way the man held himself that caught Richard's attention. He sat upright, his posture relaxed yet confident, completely absorbed in the material before him. The man's name tag peeked out from beneath his jacket, a small rectangle that read Marcus King. Richard frowned. He didn't know why, but the sight of Marcus made him uncomfortable. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sense of unease. Maybe it was the intensity with which Marcus studied the manual, or maybe it was the fact that Richard rarely interacted with people like him outside of work. Whatever it was, it left a sour taste in his mouth. When the boarding process finally began, Richard shuffled forward with the rest of the passengers, keeping his eyes glued to the ground. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who scanned it quickly before directing him toward the jet bridge. As he stepped onto the plane, he scanned the narrow aisle, searching for his seat. Row 23, aisle side. Perfect. At least he wouldn't be stuck in the middle. But as he approached his row, his stomach sank. Sitting in the window seat, his neighbor for the next 6 hours, was none other than Marcus King. Richard hesitated, his hand hovering over the overhead bin where he planned to stash his bag. For a moment he considered asking if anyone else was sitting here, hoping against hope that someone would show up and save him from this awkward situation. But no one did. Reluctantly, Richard slid into his seat, careful not to make eye contact with Marcus. He muttered a quick "excuse me" as he squeezed past, avoiding any further interaction. Once settled, he pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll through emails, using the screen as a barrier between them. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Marcus closing his manual and tucking it into the seat pocket in front of him. "You're lucky you got the aisle," Marcus said suddenly, his voice smooth and friendly. "I always prefer the window, myself." Richard froze, unsure how to respond. After a beat, he forced a tight smile and replied, "Yeah, I guess so." His tone was clipped, almost dismissive, but Marcus didn't seem bothered by it. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and gazed out the window, watching as ground crew members scurried around the tarmac below. As the minutes ticked by, Richard grew increasingly agitated. Every movement Marcus made, the rustling of his jacket, the soft tapping of his fingers on the armrest, felt louder than it should have been. Richard tried to focus on his phone, but the words blurred together on the screen. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane began to move. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin as they taxied down the runway. Richard gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles turning white. Takeoffs were always the worst part for him. The sudden acceleration, the deafening noise, the sensation of leaving solid ground behind. He closed his eyes, willing himself to stay calm. Beside him, Marcus remained perfectly still, his expression calm and composed. When the plane lifted off the ground, he turned to Richard and said, "First time flying?" Richard shook his head, without opening his eyes. No, I've flown before, I just don't like it. Marcus chuckled softly. Most people don't, but trust me, once we level off, it'll feel smoother. You'll barely even notice we're in the air. Richard managed a weak nod, though he doubted Marcus's words would do much to ease his nerves. Still, there was something oddly reassuring about the man's confidence. It was as if Marcus had done this 1,000 times before, and maybe he had. After all, he seemed to know a lot about planes, judging by the manual he'd been reading earlier. For a brief moment, Richard allowed himself to wonder what kind of person Marcus really was. Was he a pilot? An engineer? Or just someone with a passing interest in aviation? The questions swirled in his mind, but he quickly pushed them aside. Whatever Marcus's story was, it didn't matter. They were strangers sharing a temporary space, nothing more, or so Richard thought. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the clouds stretching endlessly beyond the windows, Richard found himself glancing at Marcus again. This time he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint scar running along Marcus's jawline. It was old and faded, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. Richard wondered how he'd gotten it. Had it been an accident? A fight? Something else entirely? Before he could dwell on it too long, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude and estimated arrival time. Richard listened intently, grateful for the distraction. But as the voice filled the cabin, a strange realization dawned on him. The deep, steady tone sounded familiar. Too familiar. It reminded him of Marcus. Shaking his head, Richard dismissed the thought as ridiculous. There was no way Marcus could be the pilot. He was just another passenger, like everyone else on the plane. Right? Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. And as the flight wore on, Richard couldn't help but feel that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The plane hummed steadily as it soared through the sky, its engines a constant drone in the background. Richard Gray stared out the window, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Below, fluffy white clouds stretched as far as the eye could see their edges glowing softly in the sunlight. It was peaceful, almost serene, but Richard couldn't relax. His mind kept drifting back to Marcus King, the man sitting beside him. Marcus had returned to reading his manual after the captain's announcement, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. Occasionally, he would pause to jot something, down in a small notebook or underline a section with a pen. Richard watched him from the corner of his eye, trying not to be obvious about it. There was something oddly compelling about Marcus, not just his calm demeanor, but also the way he seemed so focused, so sure of himself. "You seem really into that book," Richard said finally, breaking the silence. His voice came out louder than he intended, startling even himself. He winced inwardly, wondering if Marcus would find the comment intrusive. But instead of looking annoyed, Marcus glanced up and smiled. "It's more of a technical manual than a book," Marcus replied, holding it up slightly for Richard to see. "It covers everything about how planes work, engines, navigation systems, you name it." Richard nodded slowly, though he didn't fully understand what Marcus meant. "Do you work with planes or something?" Marcus chuckled. "You could say that. I've always been fascinated by them. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to know how they stayed up in the air." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That sounds complicated." "It can be," Marcus admitted. "But once you break it down, it's not so bad. Planes are basically big machines. They follow rules just like anything else." The explanation made sense, but Richard still felt uneasy. Something about Marcus's words lingered in his mind, nagging at him. The way Marcus talked about planes sounded almost professional, as if he wasn't just some casual enthusiast, but someone who truly understood the intricacies of aviation. And then there was the captain's voice over the intercom earlier, smooth and commanding, which bore an uncanny resemblance to Marcus's tone. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Was it possible? Could Marcus actually be involved with flying the plane? No, that couldn't be right. Pilots were supposed to be in the cockpit, not sitting next to passengers. Still, the idea refused to leave Richard's thoughts. He decided to test the waters. So, do you fly often? Richard asked, trying to sound casual. Marcus shrugged. Often enough. You pick up a few tricks when you travel a lot. Richard frowned. That answer was vague, deliberately so. It didn't confirm or deny anything. Frustrated, he leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe Marcus was just another passenger with an interest in planes. Or maybe his train of thought was interrupted when the plane hit a patch of turbulence. It wasn't severe, just a slight bump, but it was enough to make Richard grip the armrests tightly. Beside him, Marcus barely reacted, continuing to read as if nothing had happened. Is that normal? Richard asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Completely normal, Marcus assured him. Turbulence happens when the air currents change. It's harmless, trust me. Richard forced a weak smile, though his knuckles remained white. Easy for you to say. You probably deal with this all the time. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Richard with a curious expression. Actually, yes, I do. The comment caught Richard off guard. He opened his mouth to ask what Marcus meant, but stopped himself. Pushing too hard might come across as rude, and he didn't want to risk offending the man sitting next to him. Instead, he decided to let it go, for now. As the minutes passed, Richard found himself growing increasingly restless. The turbulence had subsided, but his unease hadn't. Every little noise, the hum of the engines, the creak of the cabin walls, seemed louder than usual. He glanced at Marcus again, noticing how relaxed he looked. How was it possible for someone to remain so calm while trapped inside a metal tube thousands of feet above the ground? Unable to resist any longer, Richard cleared his throat. So, have you ever met one of the pilots on your flights? Like, talked to them or anything? Marcus lowered his manual and turned to face Richard. For a moment he said nothing, his dark eyes locking onto Richard's. Then he smiled faintly. Why do you ask? Richard hesitated, suddenly aware of how suspicious his question must have sounded. I don't know. Just curious, I guess. They seem like pretty interesting people. They are, Marcus agreed. Highly trained, disciplined, responsible for hundreds of lives every time they step into the cockpit. The response sent a chill down Richard's spine. It wasn't just the content of Marcus's words. It was the way he said them, with such authority and conviction. It was as if he knew exactly what it felt like to carry that kind of responsibility. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. Before he could respond, the flight attendant approached their row, pushing a cart laden with snacks and drinks. She greeted them warmly, offering each of them a choice between soda, water, or juice. Richard opted for water while Marcus chose orange juice. As she handed them their cups, she exchanged a brief nod with Marcus, one that seemed almost respectful. When she moved on to the next row, Richard couldn't help but notice the interaction. Do you two know each other? He blurted out before thinking better of it. Marcus took a sip of his juice and shook his head. Not really. We've seen each other around, that's all. Something about the answer didn't sit right with Richard. He wanted to press further, to dig deeper into Marcus's connection to the crew, but he knew he was treading dangerous ground. Asking too many questions might make him look paranoid, or worse, prejudiced. So he settled for nodding silently and taking a sip of his water. By now, the initial excitement of the flight had worn off for most passengers. Some had fallen asleep, their heads resting against the windows or their neighbors' shoulders. Others entertained themselves with movies or games on their phones. Richard envied their ability to relax. For him, every second felt like an eternity, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. When Marcus excused himself to use the restroom, Richard seized the opportunity to investigate. He waited until Marcus disappeared down the aisle before slipping out of his seat and making his way toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door stood slightly ajar, and Richard peeked inside cautiously. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Inside the cockpit, two men sat side by side, their hands moving deftly over the controls. One of them, a younger man with sandy blonde hair, was clearly the co-pilot. But the other was unmistakably Marcus King. Dressed in full uniform, his posture commanding yet relaxed, Marcus looked every bit the part of a seasoned pilot. Richard stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had been wrong, so horribly wrong. Marcus wasn't just a passenger, he was the captain. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. How could he have misjudged someone so completely? All those assumptions, all those doubts, they now seemed foolish and shallow. Feeling a mix of shame and awe, Richard hurried back to his seat, his cheeks burning. By the time Marcus returned, Richard was staring straight ahead, pretending to focus on the movie playing on the screen in front of him. But his thoughts were elsewhere, swirling with guilt and regret. Marcus slid back into his seat without saying a word, resuming his reading as if nothing had happened. Richard, however, couldn't shake the image of Marcus in the cockpit. The confident tilt of his head, the steady movement of his hands, it was a picture of competence and control, and Richard had dismissed him based on nothing more than appearances. For the rest of the flight, Richard barely spoke. He couldn't bring himself to meet Marcus's gaze, afraid of what he might see reflected there. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds drift by. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this experience would stay with him long after the plane touched down. The plane continued its journey westward, slicing through the sky with quiet efficiency. Richard Gray sat stiffly in his seat, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't stop replaying the image of Marcus King in the cockpit, his uniform, crisp, his hands steady on the controls. It was as if everything Richard thought he knew about Marcus had been flipped upside down. The man who had seemed so ordinary just hours ago was now the person responsible for keeping hundreds of passengers safe. Richard's chest tightened at the thought. How could he have been so blind, so judgmental? He glanced at Marcus out of the corner of his eye, but Marcus didn't seem to notice. His attention was focused entirely on the manual in his lap, flipping pages methodically as though nothing unusual had happened. Richard wondered if Marcus even realized that he had been spotted near the cockpit. If he did, he wasn't letting on. The guilt gnawed at Richard relentlessly. Every time Marcus turned a page or adjusted his position, Richard felt another pang of shame. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? Sorry, I assumed you were just some random guy. That sounded ridiculous, even in his head. And what if Marcus hadn't noticed? Him sneaking around? Bringing it up might only make things worse. As the flight wore on, Richard tried to distract himself by watching the movie playing on the screen mounted in front of him. It was an action film filled with car chases and explosions, but Richard couldn't focus. The images blurred together, meaningless and distant. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to Marcus. What kind of person was he, really? Richard had judged him based on surface-level impressions. His race, his quiet confidence, and now he felt like a fool. Marcus clearly wasn't just some bookish passenger with an interest in planes. He was a professional, someone who had dedicated years of his life to mastering a skill most people wouldn't even attempt. And yet Richard had treated him like what? An inconvenience? A stereotype? Richard clenched his fists under the pretense of stretching them. He hated feeling this way, exposed, vulnerable, humiliated. But deep down, he knew he deserved it. This was karma, plain and simple. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now reality was forcing him to confront the truth. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence. Marcus's voice filled the cabin once again, calm and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching a weather system ahead. You may experience some turbulence, but there's no cause for concern. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Richard's stomach dropped. Turbulence, of course, there would be turbulence now. Just when he thought things couldn't get any worse. He gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles turning white. Beside him, Marcus closed his manual and tucked it into the seat pocket without hesitation. You okay? Marcus asked, glancing at Richard. I'm fine, Richard muttered, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his expression calm. "It'll pass soon. Like I said before, turbulence is normal. No big deal." Easy for him to say, Richard thought bitterly. He's flying the plane. But instead of snapping back, Richard forced himself to nod. "Yeah, I guess." A few moments later, the plane hit the first wave of turbulence. It wasn't severe, just a gentle rocking motion, but it was enough to set Richard's nerves on edge. Passengers murmured nervously around them, some clutching their armrests while others exchanged uneasy glances. Richard closed his eyes, willing himself to stay calm. Beside him, Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and steady. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said softly. Richard opened one eye and looked at him. "How do you stay so calm?" Marcus shrugged. "Practice, and knowing the plane can handle it helps too." "Do you ever get scared?" Richard blurted out before he could stop himself. Marcus smiled faintly. "Not anymore. Not since I learned how everything works. Once you understand the mechanics, fear doesn't have much room to grow." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the words. There was wisdom in what Marcus said, but it wasn't easy to apply. Fear wasn't rational. It crept, uninvited, feeding on uncertainty and doubt. Still, hearing Marcus talk about it made Richard feel slightly better. Maybe understanding really did help. The turbulence intensified briefly, causing the plane to dip sharply. Several passengers gasped, and a baby started crying somewhere behind them. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for impact that never came. When he finally dared to open them, Marcus was still sitting calmly beside him, his gaze fixed on the window. "This happens all the time," Marcus said, almost conversationally. "Planes are built to withstand a lot more than this." Richard managed a weak smile. "I'll take your word for it." For a while, neither of them spoke. The turbulence gradually subsided, leaving the cabin eerily quiet. Most passengers exhaled audibly, relieved that the worst was over. Richard loosened his grip on the armrests, his fingers tingling from the pressure. He glanced at Marcus again, noticing the faint scar along his jawline. Earlier, he had wondered how Marcus got it. Now he found himself wanting to ask, not out of curiosity, but as a way to break the ice. "How'd you get that scar?" Richard asked quietly, nodding toward Marcus's face. Marcus touched the scar reflexively, his fingertips brushing against the faded line. "Oh, this car accident a long time ago. Broke my jaw in 3 places." "Wow," Richard said, genuinely surprised. "That must have been rough." "It was," Marcus admitted, "but it taught me something important." "What's that?" "That life doesn't always go the way you plan. Sometimes you have to adapt, learn new ways to move forward." Richard stared at him, struck by the simplicity of the statement. It was profound yet straightforward, a lesson anyone could understand. He wondered if Marcus applied that philosophy to flying. Probably. After all, pilots dealt with unexpected challenges all the way. Weather systems, mechanical issues, human error. They had to be ready for anything. "I guess that makes sense," Richard said after a pause. "Flying must keep you on your toes." Marcus chuckled. "You could say that, but it's not just about reacting. It's about preparation, knowing what to do before it happens." Richard nodded, processing the information. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt a flicker of admiration for Marcus. Here was someone who had faced adversity and come out stronger because of it. Someone who didn't let fear dictate his actions. Richard wished he could say the same about himself. As the flight stabilized, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Passengers resumed their activities, chatting quietly or scrolling through their phones. Outside, the clouds thinned, revealing patches of blue sky. Richard watched as sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden streaks across the aisle. Turned to Marcus impulsively. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Marcus replied, raising an eyebrow. "If you don't mind me asking, why did you become a pilot?" Marcus hesitated, as if weighing his answer carefully. "It's hard to explain," he said finally. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by the idea of flight. Humans weren't meant to fly, you know? We're land creatures. But somehow we figured out how to defy gravity. To me, that's incredible, inspiring. Richard listened intently, captivated by Marcus's passion. That's amazing, he said sincerely. I never thought about it like that. Marcus smiled. Most people don't. They see planes as machines, tools, to get from point A to point B. But to me, they're symbols of human ingenuity, proof that we can achieve the impossible if we put our minds to it. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent the entire flight judging Marcus unfairly, reducing him to a stereotype. Yet here was a man whose dreams reached beyond the horizon, whose dedication inspired awe. Richard realized then that he had missed the mark entirely, not just with Marcus, but with so many others throughout his life. The plane cruised smoothly now, the worst of the turbulence behind them. Richard leaned back in his seat, his body finally beginning to relax. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly appreciate the miracle of flight. The fact that they were thousands of feet above the ground, carried safely by the skill and expertise of people like Marcus. As the minutes ticked by, Richard resolved to make amends. He didn't know how or when, but he owed Marcus an apology, not just for doubting him, but for failing to see the depth and complexity beneath the surface. Because if there was one thing Richard had learned today, it was that appearances could be deceiving. And sometimes the most extraordinary people were right in front of you. You just had to look closely enough to see them. The plane continued its steady journey westward, slicing through the endless expanse of sky. Richard Gray sat in his seat, his body finally relaxing as the turbulence faded into memory. The cabin buzzed with quiet chatter and the occasional hum of laughter from passengers who had shaken off their earlier nerves. But Richard wasn't paying attention to them. His mind was still fixated on Marcus King, the man sitting beside him, the man who had turned out to be so much more than Richard had assumed. Every time Richard glanced at Marcus, he felt a mixture of guilt and admiration. Guilt for the way he had treated Marcus earlier, dismissing him, judging him unfairly, and admiration for the calm confidence Marcus carried with him. It wasn't just about flying planes. It was about how Marcus approached life itself. His words about preparation, adaptation, and human ingenuity kept replaying in Richard's mind. They were simple truths, yet they carried weight. Richard couldn't help but wonder how different his own life might have been if he had embraced those lessons sooner. For a while, neither of them spoke. Marcus seemed content to gaze out the window, watching the clouds drift by like cotton candy stretched across the horizon. Richard, however, found himself struggling to stay silent. He wanted to say something meaningful, to bridge the gap between them, but he didn't know where to start. How do you apologize for being prejudiced without sounding defensive or insincere? Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Marcus, he began hesitantly, can I ask you another question? Marcus turned to face him, his expression open and curious. Sure. What's on your mind? Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. How do you handle it? All the responsibility, I mean. Knowing that people's lives depend on you, every single day. Marcus smiled faintly as if he had expected the question. It's not easy, he admitted. There's always pressure when you're in charge of something this important, but I focus on what I can control. Training, preparation, communication, all those things matter more than worrying about what-ifs. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the answer. Do you ever doubt yourself? Sometimes, Marcus said honestly. But doubt isn't necessarily bad. It keeps me sharp, makes me double-check my work. As long as I trust the process and my team, I know we'll get through anything. The response struck a chord with Richard. Trust the process. It sounded so simple, but it resonated deeply. For years, Richard had let fear and uncertainty dictate his actions. Whether it was avoiding risks at work or making snap judgments about people based on appearances, he had always leaned toward caution. Now listening to Marcus, he realized how limiting that mindset could be. You make it sound easy, Richard said after a pause. It's not easy, Marcus replied with a chuckle. Nothing worth doing ever is, but it's rewarding. Knowing you've helped someone reach their destination safely, it's a good feeling. Richard looked away, his chest tightening. Marcus's humility was almost overwhelming. Here was a man whose skills saved lives daily, yet he spoke about it with such modesty. Richard couldn't imagine having that kind of impact on the world. He felt small in comparison, a cog in a machine rather than someone shaping outcomes. The conversation lapsed into silence. Richard found himself reflecting on his own life. He thought about his job, his relationships, the choices he had made over the years. Had he ever truly pushed himself beyond his comfort zone? Or had he simply coasted, playing it safe and avoiding challenges? The answers weren't comforting. The intercom crackled again, pulling Richard from his thoughts. This time it was the co-pilot speaking, a younger man named Jake Miller, according to the introduction. His voice was cheerful as he announced that they were beginning their descent into Los Angeles. Passengers stirred around them, gathering belongings and adjusting seatbelts in anticipation of landing. Outside, the blue sky gave way to glimpses of sprawling cityscapes and winding freeways below. Richard glanced at Marcus, wondering if he would return to the cockpit before landing. Instead, Marcus stayed seated, buckling his seatbelt with practiced ease. "We're almost there," he said, noticing Richard's gaze. "Yeah," Richard replied, forcing a smile. "Feels like it went by fast." Marcus nodded. "Time flies when you're busy." The comment hung in the air, and Richard couldn't help but laugh softly. I guess that's true for some people. As the plane descended, the familiar sensation of pressure filled Richard's ears. He swallowed hard, trying to adjust. Beside him, Marcus remained perfectly composed, his posture relaxed even as the aircraft rocked gently against crosswinds. Richard envied his calmness. No matter how many times he flew, he doubted he would ever feel completely at ease during takeoff or landing. When the wheels touched down with a soft thud, the cabin erupted into applause. Passengers clapped enthusiastically, grateful for the safe arrival. Richard joined in half-heartedly, his hands moving automatically. But his heart wasn't in it. Not because he wasn't thankful, far from it, but because he knew he owed Marcus more than polite gratitude. Once the plane taxied to the gate and came to a stop, the flight attendants opened the doors, ushering everyone off. Most passengers disembarked quickly, eager to stretch their legs or reunite with loved ones waiting beyond the terminal. Richard lingered behind, pretending to search for something in his bag. He wanted to catch Marcus alone, to thank him properly, or at least try. When the aisle cleared, Marcus stood up and reached for his carry-on from the overhead bin. Richard followed suit, clearing his throat nervously. "Hey, Marcus?" Marcus paused, turning to face him. "Yeah?" Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. You handled that flight like a pro." Marcus smiled, clearly amused. "That's my job." "I know," Richard said quickly. "But still, I appreciate it. And I owe you an apology too." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "An apology? For what?" "For how I acted earlier," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I judged you unfairly. When we first met, I assumed, well, I don't even know what I assumed, but it wasn't fair. You didn't deserve that." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Apology accepted. Just remember, people are more than what you see on the surface." Richard nodded fervently. "I know that now. Believe me, I won't forget it." With that, Marcus shouldered his bag and started down the aisle, leaving Richard standing there. For a moment, Richard considered following him, saying more. But he realized that sometimes less was more. Marcus had already given him plenty to think about. As Richard stepped off the plane and entered the bustling terminal, he felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The experience had changed him, forcing him to confront his biases and rethink his assumptions. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: He wouldn't look at people the same way again. And somewhere high above the clouds, Marcus King climbed back into the cockpit, ready to guide another group of strangers safely home. The airport terminal in Los Angeles was alive with energy. Streams of passengers poured out of the gates, dragging suitcases behind them or clutching coffee cups as they hurried to their next destinations. Richard Gray moved slowly, his steps deliberate as he navigated the crowded space. His mind was still reeling from the events of the flight, the turbulence, the realization about Marcus King, and the awkward apology that followed. Every detail felt fresh in his memory, like a movie playing on repeat. He stopped near a row of windows overlooking the tarmac, watching planes taxi and take off in the distance. The sight filled him with a strange mix of awe and unease. Just hours ago, he had been inside one of those machines, trusting his life to someone he barely knew, and someone he had initially judged unfairly. Now, standing here, he couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of it all. Flying wasn't just about engines and wings, it was about people. People like Marcus, who carried responsibility with grace and humility. Richard sighed deeply, leaning against the glass. He wished he could turn back time and erase the way he had acted earlier. Not just during the flight, but throughout his life. How many times had he let biases cloud his judgment? How many opportunities had he missed because he refused to look beyond surface impressions? The questions swirled in his mind, leaving him restless. As he stood there lost in thought, a young woman approached the window beside him. She wore a bright yellow scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, its vibrant color standing out against the muted tones of the terminal. Her dark hair framed her face, and she carried a sketch pad tucked under one arm. Richard noticed her immediately, not because of her appearance, but because of the calm aura she exuded. There was something comforting about her presence, almost magnetic. She glanced at him briefly before turning her attention to the planes outside. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, gesturing toward the runway. Richard blinked, surprised by the sudden conversation. "What's beautiful?" "The way they glide through the air," she replied, smiling faintly. "Even when they're huge and heavy, they look so free." He nodded slowly, considering her words. "Yeah, I guess. They do. I'm Anna," she added after a pause, extending her hand. "Richard," he responded, shaking it. Her grip was firm but gentle, mirroring the balance she seemed to bring to everything else. They stood side by side for a while, watching the planes come and go. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, almost companionable. Richard appreciated that. After the emotional roller coaster of the past few hours, he needed moments like this. Moments where he didn't have to explain himself or justify his actions. Eventually, Anna broke the quiet. "Are you waiting for someone?" "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked curiously. He hesitated, unsure how much to share. But there was something trustworthy about Anna, something that made him want to open up. "I was on a flight earlier," he began cautiously, "and I met someone, a pilot. At first, I didn't realize he was the captain. I judged him based on, well, stupid things that don't matter." Anna tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What changed your mind?" "He handled the flight perfectly," Richard explained. "Even when we hit turbulence, he stayed calm. And later I found out how qualified he is. It made me realize how wrong I'd been." "That must have been tough," Anna said sympathetically, "facing that kind of truth." "It was," Richard admitted. "But it was also eye-opening. I've spent so much of my life making assumptions about people without really knowing them. It's embarrassing, honestly." Anna smiled gently. "We all do it sometimes. The important thing is learning from it." Her words struck a chord with Richard. They echoed Marcus's earlier advice about adaptation and growth. He wondered if Anna realized how profound her insights were, or if she simply spoke from experience. Either way, he found himself nodding in agreement. "You're right. I just hope I can do better moving forward." "You will," Anna assured him. Every day is a chance to start over. The simplicity of her statement resonated deeply. Richard felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Maybe change wasn't as impossible as he had always believed. Maybe it started with small steps, like apologizing to Marcus or striking up a conversation with a stranger at an airport. After a few more minutes of chatting, Anna checked her watch and sighed. "I should probably get going. My connecting. Flight leaves soon." "Where are you headed?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "Seattle," she replied. "I'm visiting family." "That sounds nice," he said warmly. "Safe travels." "Thanks," Anna said, smiling again. "And good luck with everything, Richard." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard watched her go, feeling oddly grateful for their brief encounter. In just a few minutes, Anna had managed to lift some of the weight off his shoulders. Her kindness reminded him that not everyone was quick to judge, that there were still good, understanding people in the world. Feeling lighter, Richard decided to grab a cup of coffee before heading to baggage claim. As he waited in line at the cafe, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. Most of them were work-related, reminders about deadlines and meetings. Normally, these messages would stress him out, but today they felt manageable. Perhaps it was the clarity he had gained during the flight, or maybe it was Anna's encouragement. Whatever the reason, Richard resolved to tackle his responsibilities with renewed focus. When he reached the counter, the barista greeted him with a friendly smile. "What can I get you?" "Just a black coffee, please," Richard replied. As the barista prepared his drink, Richard glanced around the bustling cafe. Families sat together sharing snacks, travelers hunched over laptops typing furiously, and couples laughed quietly over cups of tea. The diversity of the scene struck him. So many different lives intersecting in one place, each person carrying their own stories and struggles. For the first time, Richard truly appreciated the beauty of it. His thoughts drifted back to Marcus. What was he doing now? Had he already boarded another flight, guiding yet another group of passengers safely to their destination? Or was he enjoying a rare moment of downtime, perhaps reading another chapter of that technical manual? Richard hoped it was the latter. Marcus deserved a break after everything he had done today, not just for flying the plane, but for teaching Richard an invaluable lesson. By the time Richard collected his coffee and headed toward baggage claim, his mood had shifted completely. The guilt and shame he had carried earlier had softened, replaced by determination. He didn't know exactly how he would change, but he knew he wanted to try. Whether it was being more open-minded at work, treating strangers with kindness, or simply taking the time to understand others' perspectives, Richard vowed to make an effort. At baggage claim, he spotted his suitcase rolling down the conveyor belt and grabbed it quickly. As he wheeled it toward the exit, he caught sight of a sign advertising volunteer opportunities at local shelters. The words, "Give Back," were printed boldly across the top. Richard paused, staring at the poster. He had never considered volunteering before. It wasn't something he thought he had time for. But now the idea appealed to him. Maybe helping others was the best way to repay the lessons he had learned today. With newfound resolve, Richard snapped a picture of the sign and saved it to his phone. He didn't commit to anything immediately, but the seed had been planted. As he stepped outside into the warm California sunshine, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Life wasn't perfect, and neither was he. But for the first time in a long time, Richard believed he could be better. And somewhere far above, Marcus King soared through the skies once again, unaware of the ripple effect his actions had created. Weeks passed, and Richard Gray found himself back at the same airport terminal in New York City. This time, he wasn't flying to Los Angeles, but heading to Chicago for a business conference. The familiar sights and sounds of the bustling terminal brought back memories of his last trip, the turbulence, the realization about Marcus King, and the quiet conversation with Anna near the windows. Those moments had stayed with him, shaping the way he thought about people and situations. As he stood in line to board his flight, Richard couldn't help but reflect on how much he had changed since that day. He had started volunteering at a EI local shelter twice a month, serving meals and chatting with the guests who came through the doors. At work, he made an effort to listen more and judge less, especially when it came to colleagues whose backgrounds or personalities were different from his own. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard. But he was trying. And that, he reminded himself, was what mattered most. When it was finally his turn to board, Richard handed his ticket to the attendant and stepped onto the plane. As he walked down the narrow aisle searching for his seat, he noticed something unusual. Sitting in the window seat of row 15, the seat next to his, was a young woman wearing glasses and reading a novel. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She looked up briefly as he approached, offering a polite smile before returning to her book. Richard hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the aisle seat. "Hi," he said warmly, setting his bag under the seat in front of him. "I'm Richard." "Emily," she replied, closing her book and shaking his hand. Her grip was firm, her expression friendly. "It's nice to meet you," Richard added, settling into his seat. For the first time in ages, he didn't feel uneasy about sitting next to someone new. If anything, he felt curious. What kind of person was Emily? Where was she headed? What stories did she carry with her? The plane began to fill up quickly, and soon the cabin was alive with the usual pre-flight activity. Passengers stowed their bags, adjusted their seats, and chatted quietly with one another. Richard glanced at Emily, noticing the title of her book, The Alchemist. He recognized it immediately. It was one of his favorites. "That's a great choice," he said, nodding toward the book. "Have you read it before?" "No, this is my first time," Emily replied, holding it up slightly. "I've heard good things about it, though. Have you read it?" "I have," Richard said, smiling. "It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finish it. The lessons are simple, but they stick." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I'm hoping for. Sometimes I need reminders to look beyond the obvious." Her words struck a chord with Richard. They reminded him of his own journey over the past few weeks, how he had learned to see beyond surface impressions and embrace deeper truths. He wanted to tell her about Marcus, about Anna, about everything he had experienced. But he held back, sensing that some stories were better left unspoken unless the moment called for them. As the plane taxied down the runway, Richard felt the familiar rumble of the engines beneath him. He gripped the armrest instinctively, though not as tightly as he used to. Beside him, Emily remained calm, flipping through the pages of her book as if nothing unusual was happening. Her composure impressed him. "You don't seem nervous," he commented lightly. "Not really," she said with a shrug. "I love flying. There's something magical about being up in the air." Richard chuckled softly. "I wish I could say the same. I've never been a big fan of planes." "Why not?" Emily asked, genuinely curious. He paused, considering how to answer. "I guess I've always been afraid of losing control. Being stuck in a metal tube thousands of feet above the ground isn't exactly comforting." Emily smiled knowingly. "I get that. But think about it this way. You're trusting experts to keep you safe. Pilots train for years to do what they do. They know what they're doing." Her words reminded Richard of Marcus again. Trusting experts. That's what Marcus had done every time he stepped into the cockpit, and what Richard had failed to recognize during their flight together. He nodded slowly, appreciating the reminder. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing higher into the sky. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, painted gold by the setting sun. Richard gazed out the window, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. Maybe it was Emily's presence, or maybe it was the progress he had made since his last trip. Whatever the reason, he felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of his past biases no longer pressed down on him quite so heavily. After a while, Emily set her book aside and turned to face him. "So, Richard, what do you do for work?" "I'm in sales," he replied. "Mostly corporate stuff. How about you?" "I teach high school English," she said proudly. "It's challenging, but rewarding. I love helping students discover the power of storytelling." That's amazing, Richard said sincerely. You must have a lot of patience. She laughed softly. You'd be surprised. Some days are harder than others, but it's worth it when you see a student connect with a story, or even write one of their own. They continued talking throughout the flight, sharing bits and pieces of their lives. Emily told him about her passion for literature and her dream of writing a novel someday. Richard shared stories from his volunteer work at the shelter, describing the joy he felt when someone smiled because of something small he had done. By the time the captain announced their descent into Chicago, they had formed an easy rapport. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Emily turned to him with a warm smile. Thanks for the chat, Richard. It made the flight go by faster. Same here, he said, meaning it. Safe travels. Once the plane came to a stop, Richard gathered his belongings and stepped into the aisle. Before leaving, he glanced back at Emily, who was busy collecting her things. For a brief moment, he considered saying something more, thanking her for reminding him of the importance of connection, but decided against it. Sometimes actions spoke louder than words. In the terminal, Richard walked toward baggage claim, his mind buzzing with thoughts. Meeting Emily had been unexpected yet meaningful. Like Anna before her, she had reminded him of the value of openness and curiosity. Each interaction, no matter how brief, carried the potential to shape his perspective in subtle ways. As he waited for his suitcase to appear on the conveyor belt, Richard spotted a poster advertising a diversity workshop hosted by the airport. The headline read, "See Beyond the Surface." He stared at it for a long moment, reflecting on how far he had come since meeting Marcus. From judging someone unfairly to embracing differences, his journey had been transformative and ongoing. By the time he exited the terminal and stepped into the crisp evening air, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them with an open heart and mind. Somewhere high above, Marcus King continued to inspire strangers without even realizing it. And somewhere closer to the ground, Richard Gray carried those lessons forward, determined to live differently, one flight, one conversation, one moment at a time.